Recording in progress.
Okay. That's going to be good, isn't it? Nico. Give me a minute to move over to the other one. Okay, sorry about that. I thought I was going to do this on my other computer, but it's turned into a nightmare. So give me a minute and I'll call the slides up. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for your patience while I set that up. Okay, today we're going to look at how to write a POLS essay. This is a PowerPoint presentation I gave last Monday for POLSA. And in that particular version, I tried to speak quite generally about POLS, whether it was international relations that you were writing an essay for, or comparative politics, or domestic politics, or political theory. I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to specifically talk to international relations, and I'm going to try and get a little bit faster to the main point, which is how do you do your essays that are coming up for POLS104. But I want to start generally and then sort of focus down as I go, because this is the time where you get it really right and you set up for the rest of your undergrad and master's degree. And it's getting to the point, and I think probably many of you recognize that now, that if you want to convert your university education into a fantastic job, you need to probably do a master's degree. We have two fantastic master's degrees. One of those is the Master of International Relations, and the other one is the Master of Politics. What you do now sets yourself up for doing that really well in 3 years' time, or 4 years' time if you're doing a law degree, or whatever the length is for a law degree. Okay, I don't really know. But I do know that one of the reasons why you would want to write a POLS essay well is because you want to get a top mark, and nobody wants a top mark in their first year more than a prospective law student. So if you're a law student, this is how you go about getting a top mark. If you're a POLS major, and particularly somebody that's interested in international relations as part of your major degree, then you want to get it right from the very beginning, don't you? You don't want to learn as you go. You want to have the basics right. So that's the importance of this lecture or tutorial for you. And if you're not doing either a POLS major or a law degree and you're just here because you're interested in it, well, there might be some benefits to you for other essays that you have to write. Equally, it just means that you'll absorb the information better that you got out of this course. So there's my details. I'll share these slides on Blackboard, and I am recording it, as you know, so there will be the opportunity for you to watch this again. I'll put it on YouTube, I think, rather than Blackboard. I do have office hours every week. If you want to discuss your essay with me or anything related to this course or outside of this course, just email me and we'll set up a time either in the office hours or if it's a private conversation at another time. So today we're looking at several things. We're looking at research and preparation. When do you start? What are you looking for in getting your essay? Great. We're looking at developing an argument and stating it, where the thesis statement is the core idea. We're using theory because, after all, this is political science. This isn't history or any other social science paper. It's a political science paper, so you're expected to use theory. We're going to look at structuring your argument, alternative explanations, how to present your essay, what you might expect in terms of having your essay graded, and challenging the grade if you're not happy with it. And then we'll look at the essays themselves for POLS104 that are coming up, and how you might go about it using the theory. So obviously the first question is, what do you want from doing this essay? And as I pointed out, if you're a law student, you want an A so that you can get into law next year. But there's more to it than that. What do you actually want in terms of a career or some sort of outcome at the end of your degree? And I think it's worth pointing out, particularly those who've just started at university, that there's usually a eureka moment, perhaps in year 2 if you're lucky, almost certainly in year 3, where you suddenly, a light bulb switches on and you realize that the paper that you're doing is the paper that you, or the area that you're really loving and really interested in. And that may not seem so obvious in the first and second semester, but something happens in year 2 or 3 and you go, oh, this is why I'm here. This is what it's all for. And one of those things might be that you decide that you really want to do a certain career. That career might be something in the international relations realm or in the national security realm. So it might be working as a diplomat, working as a trade negotiator, might be in the intelligence and security. You might decide you want to become an intelligence analyst, or in the defense forces or the Ministry of Defense, where defense is something of interest to you. I'm not saying that that will happen, but what I am saying is that if it happens late, like year 2 or year 3, you might regret the fact that your early essays, your early grades weren't perhaps as good as you want them to be now. You know, all of those areas are quite competitive. They'll be looking at your grades. And if you've started off with C's and B's when you could have been getting A's, then you're going to kick yourself. So why not get A's now is the argument. Why not try 5 or 10% harder than you were planning to and turn that into something that's going to have a great track record when you want to utilize it? Do you get better at writing POLS essays as you go along? Yes, you probably do. Definitely practice makes perfect, but also there becomes what I call a sixth sense that descends on you. It certainly descends on you around masters. It might come earlier, where you just feel in your bones whether you've done enough for a mellow puff or not. That ought to happen as quickly as possible, because otherwise you're writing essays not really knowing if they're any good or not. You'd much rather have that sixth sense. So again, what we're doing today is trying to develop that sixth sense where you can tell as you put your pen down or your keyboard closed that you've really done something terrific, and you can't think of any holes in the argument, anything that you need to go back and fix. You're pretty sure you've done what you need to do to get a good mark. And that's an important thing to be able to have. How much time can you devote to researching and writing? The simple answer is as much as you can. The thing is that everybody goes through a period, particularly in your undergrad years, where you're really struggling to stay afloat. Not necessarily because the work's so hard, but because there's so many demands on your time. And everybody has that problem. It's not just you. But trying to work out how much time you should devote to something and when to call it a day is not an easy thing to tackle. As a law student, when you do law, you will know what your priorities are, because the law people will tell you very clearly that if you don't make the grade, you're out. So all of a sudden, your priorities might shift in year 3, not in year 2, because if you're accepted, you'll only be doing law in year 2. But by year 3, you might be saying, well, this POLS thing's nice, but you know, I've got to put my energy into law, because that's where it counts. You know, the thing is that a lot of law students end up coming back to POLS in year 3 or year 4 for masters, and their real love is in POLS. And obviously, we want to woo them over to the dark side by making them love POLS more than they love law. But the point I'm making is that that priority thing becomes really quite a dilemma between getting some marks in something that you know will transfer into a job at a prestigious law firm, and getting marks in something that maybe just excites you a whole lot more. So how much time can you devote to researching and writing? That's a question of just get a good time management, really, and working out how soon to start things, when to walk away from it, and when to give yourself a little bit of peace and quiet from it, because nobody wants to be working their asses off night and day and having no other kind of life outside of that. Okay, research and prep. So the point I was trying to make there was that the sooner you start your essays, the better off you are. And the reason, the biggest reason why, is because if you start early, you can put it away for a couple of days. You can put it down and come back to it. And you can't do that if you start late. So the thing you learn when you start early is that you might write a page or 2 or something like that, and then come back to it a day later or 2 days later, because you've got time to do that, and discover that half of what you've written was absolute rubbish and the other half is savable. That's just part of the process of writing. It's better, first of all, to get a lot down. It's no good inside your head. You're better to write and realize that half of it's rubbish than not write at all. But it's also part of that editing process where you say, well, you know, I don't think I needed to have said that at all. Like, that's not really anything to do with the question. I just put that there because it was top of mind. Or I'm just not doing a very good job of editing this, staying on the ball. And if you've given yourself at least 2 weeks, and perhaps a little bit more, then you're just so much better in control of the essay than if you try to start it a week before or 3 days before or the night before. Because the thing about the week before, 3 days before or night before is that you don't have that luxury of going back and determining what's crap or not. And in fact, because you're rushing it, you don't know what's good and you don't know what's bad, and you're just delivering stuff where you could be pretty sure half of it's rubbish, right? So just not a good way of doing it. Read the question. So, you know, every year, particularly in POLS 104, we always get through 3 or 4 people that are so miles away from what Robert Patman asked them to write that it's not even an essay that you can mark, simply because they misunderstood what they were asked to do. Now, you panic in an exam, and everybody's done it and not read the essay question properly in an exam because you're under stress, because the clock is ticking, and everybody has made that mistake. I've made it myself many times. But you shouldn't be in that position when you're writing an essay during the semester. You have time to read the thing and try and work out what it's asking you to do. And if you don't do that, you're in trouble. So write the essay question at the top of your essay and keep it there. Again, every year we have people who hand in essay papers where they don't even tell us what question they're answering. And sometimes, as I say, the question, the way it's been answered is so far removed from what the essay question was that we have to read 3 or 4 pages before we can even try and work out what question they're trying to answer. You know, so it's a twofold thing. One is obviously you don't want to make my life miserable when I'm marking it. And the other thing is that you want to stay absolutely on target all the way through your essay. You want to make sure that you begin, middle and end on the essay question and not something that's off topic. So write the essay question on top of your essay, and particularly do that in exams, because that's the best reference you've got while you're writing the exam question, exam answer, that you're staying on top of. Okay, this is me spitballing here, and you might think of it differently, but in my view, there's 3 different ways you can write an essay. And let's start with the one I think people do get told at the very beginning of their undergrad degree, that this is the way you do it. And I call it the philosophy approach, because I was told in philosophy that this was the way you write an essay. And that is to read the text and then mull it over and just let it sink into you. It's sort of the approach. Oh, that's very interesting. Let me just process that in my mind over a series of days or weeks, and some sort of wisdom will be imparted to me. Now, there's a reason why the philosophy people say that. And the reason why is that philosophy texts are usually pretty hard. If you're reading Hobbes or Locke or anything like that, which is written in the 18th century or before, the language is something that you're not used to, and it's pretty dense to read. And so this whole idea that you would sort of stop and mull it over and go, what does it really mean, is appropriate when the texts are dense. But in international relations, that's not true. So I don't see that this approach actually is all that useful for you trying to churn out assignment after assignment after assignment after assignment in the course of a semester. So scrap that idea. The second one, I think, is the one that we all do, and many of us do it through our entire degrees and never learn another way of doing it. And that's the research and take notes approach. In other words, I'm reading a book and I've got my computer open while I'm reading my book, and I just take notes, and then I glue all the notes together and jiggle them around a little bit, and I've got an essay. And I would guarantee that 99% of essays are written this way. You know, you see yourself doing the hard work, that is, you're taking notes. You see content appearing on your screen, which is the notes appearing on your screen, and you think that's an essay, and it ain't an essay. It's not even close. Hold on, I'm going to get my glass. The problem with that approach is it's so similar to this thing I was talking about in terms of writing something down and not knowing what's good and what's bad. With the taking notes approach, the fact that you've got something that even strings together as an essay is entirely dependent on what books you're reading and what notes you're taking. You're definitely filling out the word count, which might be 1,500 words or it might be 3,000 words, sure. But are those concepts, is that information in any way an essay? No, it's not. It's just a whole lot of notes that you've turned into an essay. So I think this is something we have to all get past. I'm not saying that you don't take notes, and I'm not saying that you don't read books and try and determine which books are useful to you and which are not. What I am saying is that it's something missing. And that's the third one. Research and tick boxes. So those of you who are doing my tutorials realize by now that I'm pretty pedantic in terms of using the theory. Robert's introduced you to the theory. He's given you enough notes to be able to at least start an essay using the theory. And the Melian dialogue that we all did together was an attempt to get us to understand a little bit about how the mechanics of the theory works, right? So we do know some basics about realism, and we can see that realism or liberalism or constructivism all can apply to a case study like the Melian dialogue. The thing about the next step, the bit where it starts to really work for you, is that it's very much a tick the boxes approach. You look for certain things that the theory expects you to look for, and when you found it in your evidence, in your case study, you tick the box and you move on. So using a theory is a bit like a cookbook. You know what the ingredients are when you start making the dish. You know how long to cook it for, at what temperature, and all of those things. If you follow the instructions, and the instructions have been written well, then you're going to turn up with a dish at the end of it that's pretty close to what the guy that wrote the recipe thought you were going to do, right? Not much chance of mucking it up. And that's exactly the same if you use the theory, right? So I'm going to concentrate on the theory in a little while and give you enough of an indication of how it's going to be used on your essays that you don't need to be frightened about it. But the beauty of the theory is this tick the boxes approach, which is you know that if you've ticked all of the boxes, that you've written an essay that the theory would agree with. And you haven't left anything out. And you haven't made this selection of what should be in the essay because the theory gave you the selection and told you what to do. So it's very dissimilar to this research and take notes approach where you're just selecting the text and taking notes down almost at random, right? It gives you a skeleton or a framework that you can write your essay on. Sources. So Robert's given you a very, very extensive source list in the course guide, right? Too long in my view, far too long. I think Robert's showing off. But he will give you some key sources that he thinks are relevant to the essays that you're writing. And on top of that, it's not just Robert, but every lecturer will do this. They will give you a reading list. And the reason why they've given you a reading list is because they agree or they disagree with the writers. And they're saying, these are the people, this is the arguments that you should be reading and listening to. So if you go outside of that list, and again, find something that's entirely at random, and this is especially true of the theory, there's a huge danger you're going to end up citing writers that your lecturer thinks are idiots. You've got no idea who those idiots are at this stage. I did this in year 2 a few years ago where I was the first person in the class and I just read something in the New Yorker and I was showing off to my lecturer and I said, did you see that article in the New Yorker? And he looked at me disdainfully because the guy that had written in the New Yorker was a guy that my lecturer thought was an idiot. and he thought, because I was reading this thing and obviously thinking it was quite clever, that I might be an idiot too. And he may well have been right. The point is, don't do sources that are outside of the list that your lecturer has given you. Now, the thing about those lists is that they don't get updated every year. Sometimes a new one sneaks in, but for the most part, they languish for years and years and years and don't get updated. But the people that they're citing do update their work. So, if you get a particular writer and you try and find out what that writer's written since that document, that article or that book, maybe you've got a date that's 2008 and you find he's written 3 books since then you're supplying new information, new thinking about the subject that's consistent with the argument, but also consistent with what your lecturer thinks is a good source, right? And sometimes you'll surprise the lecturer by finding a source that he really likes or really has a lot of empathy for, but it's a more recent version of it. That's where you get the brownie points, not by picking somebody at random. Okay, knowing when to stop and when to return to the readings again. So this is this thing about the sixth sense. Some point you say, I've done enough, I can stop now, I've got every loose end tied up. And sometimes you can say, there's something missing here and I know where to go for that. That sixth sense is something that you'll get over time. But again, if you're using theory, you've got a much firmer grasp. I've got a box unticked. I've got to go back and tick that box. Okay, developing an argument. Can I just stop here for a minute and ask that everybody sees that on screen? Because I gave a lecture this morning and nobody was seeing my slides.
Yeah, we can see.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, we can see.
Good. Okay, developing an argument. Okay, this is the money shot. This is the one where you really have to prove your worth, right? So probably this screen's the most important of them all. You're expected in POLS to have an argument, right? And your lecturer is looking for an argument when he reads or she reads your essay. And that is the nice thing about POLS. That's why when I came here to do a history degree and I ended up doing a POLS degree about 8 years ago when I was an undergraduate, because I just sensed that I liked the fact that in politics, it didn't matter what your argument was, so long as you had an argument. Whereas in history, it tended to be, I'm sorry, you're arguing against the mainstream of historical debate, so we don't want to hear it. Now, I know I'm being rude about history and I don't mean it like that. What I'm saying is that the delight for me was that they champion anybody that can have write a decent argument in POLS. Even if it's an argument they vehemently disagree with, they're impressed because you've written it well. Okay, so your lecturer starts a course, he designs a course based around some things he wants or she wants to say, and he looks for it when you write the essay, right? Does this person understand what this course is about? Does this person understand why we're doing this course? Right? You may not always be able to sneak something as deep as that into your essay, but by the end of your exam, if you haven't got those touch buttons, there's something wrong. So when you develop an argument that your lecturer wants you to do, this is called a thesis statement, and it's as simple as, in this essay, I am going to argue that. And if you've got those magic words in your introduction, in this essay, I am going to argue that, then you're really on your way to having a terrific essay, right? And I will be marking, I don't know, 50 or 60 essays in a few weeks' time of yours. And you can almost guarantee that half of them I will write at the end of the introduction, where is your thesis statement? Because people just don't do it. Too many people don't do it. And it's not an essay without one. The whole essay is designed to deliver on the promise. The thesis statement is your core idea, right? in this essay, I am going to argue that. Okay, what do I mean by what am I going to argue? So it could be something as simple as I'm going to argue that John Mearsheimer is wrong when he discusses the reasons why the Ukraine-Russia war happened. Or I'm going to argue that John Mearsheimer is right when he discusses NATO expansion as being the reason for the Ukraine war. It could be as simple as showing that the theory works. I'm going to argue that realism is the best way of looking at the origins of the Cold War because realism shows great power politics are crucial to understanding the international system. And the theory working is actually the key model for most master's and PhD dissertations. So if you've got the swing of how to use the theory and write an essay with the theory in it, then you are halfway to understanding how to write a master's. So by the year 3, if you're thinking, okay, I'm serious about this, I want to become a diplomat or I want to become an intelligence analyst or whatever, security specialist, I'm going to do a master's. If you're comfortable using theory in your essays, then the master's is not going to be a shock to you. Consider alternative explanations. We are good social scientists, and a social scientist follows an approach called the scientific method, where we observe things happening and we determine why they're happening, and maybe even some degree of prediction about it happening next. In other words, if I drop the pen to the floor, I know that every time I drop it, it will fall to the floor. You know, I'm observing that, I see that happening, and therefore I can make a prediction of some sort. If I know nothing about gravity, I could say that the reason it falls to the floor is because there's a giant sleeping under the floor with magical powers drawing everything towards him. It's not a very good explanation for it, but it is an explanation. If I'm a scientist, I say, no, gravity is what's drawing it to the floor. I have a theory of gravity, which is better than my theory of the giant pulling the pen to the floor. This is social science. When you write an essay, you say, I believe that realism explains the Melian dialogue better than the other two theories, but I'm a good social scientist, so I will tell you what the other two theories would say and why I don't think they're as persuasive as the realist argument. So you've already been doing that to some extent in the Melian dialogue simulation. You're just doing this now on paper. Last, do not frighten your lecturer. Stay within the limits of the course. There are few prizes for originality in an undergraduate degree. They want you to either regurgitate what they told you, or at least stick within some sort of framework that they set up. For example, every year we do POLS 104. Robert says we're not doing Marxism as a theory in 104. And every year I introduce Marxism into the Melian dialogue because I think it's a bloody good theory. And it's worth being there, just even if it's there for 5 minutes to give us a taste for it. Every year somebody writes a Marxist argument for one of the questions, like why did the Cold War end? And a Marxist argument, as I said to my class, tutorial class, is usually so far away from what Robert wants to hear that he's absolutely distraught that he's got to mark something which isn't giving him the answers that he's looking for. And what we usually do, because usually some of the brightest students are Marxists, so nothing we can do about that, is that we say to the student, okay, you got away with it this time, but you're never going to get away with it again. They don't even try that one on us, that we weren't asked to do it, a Marxist interpretation. Don't frighten us. And that can be true of anything where you say, oh, I've got something here which is so refreshingly different. I'll bet Robert Patman's not even read this book. It's brand new, it was on the shelf last week. I'm going to do my essay answering it using this new book. He won't welcome you for it. A, he's got to go and read the bloody book before he can even critique your critique. And B, he doesn't want to read the book. So don't do it. Don't frighten the lecturer. Okay, theory, using theory. So I've talked a lot about it, and now I'm going to give you some feel for how to use it. First of all, the theory is a roadmap, right? It tells you what to look out for and what should happen. We call what should happen causality. Okay, a theory is a theory of causality. If X, then Y. So there's an expectation that if you look for one thing, then another thing will follow. As I said to you, make sure you're getting your sources right, and particularly with theory. The problem with international relations theory is that people are quite passionate about it. If you're a liberal, you don't like realists. You cannot abide them. You can't even bear to be in the room with them. They're warmongers. If you're a realist, you think that liberals are a joke. And you can't hear a liberal argument without bursting into laughter because you think they're so naive. If you're a constructivist, you tend to be quite a brain box, right? Brain boxes are automatically attracted to constructivism because they think it's just like with Marxism. It's a little bit harder than everything else everybody else is doing, so I'm going to do it. So the problem with this is that if your source is from one of the opposition writers, they're going to rubbish the theory. So if you pick up a book and you don't know that the writer is a liberal, and they're explaining to you how realism works, they're going to belittle it, or they're going to be damning by omission. They're going to leave bits out that they really can't be bothered with because it's a dumb theory anyway. You're not doing yourself any favors by selecting a source that isn't the real guys, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're writing from a realist perspective, a constructivist perspective, or a liberal idealist perspective. You stick with those guys because they believe in their theories and they work hard to make sure they work, right? The other guys don't care about their theories. So be very selective about it. And if you're having problems finding a source to use your theory, come to me and ask me who to use. I'll give it to you. Quite happy to. As I said, using theory is a tick the box process. You go to your evidence, you look for the examples in the evidence that the theory expects to see there. I'll talk about that in a minute. If you've ticked all the boxes, then your theory is working and you can feel good about it. My argument is coming together really nicely. I've got all of the components that the theory expects me to have. It's all coming along tickety-boo. If it's not working and you're not finding what you want, maybe you use another theory. And as I say, your tutor will help with the theory. Every year, I give out 4 or 5 documents, which are just the basics. I say, quote this. And you'll be fine. The lovely thing about the theory is once you've got your definitions there, you use them again and again. It's a cut and paste. I've got to write another essay 4 or 5 weeks later. I'm using realism. I cut out my realism paragraph and I stick it in. Even the top realists, even the top liberals, even the top social constructivists, all cut and paste the theory section of their essay. There's no point in rewriting the damn thing again. That's already there. Okay, structuring your argument. So what we're talking about here is the essay itself, right? How do you lay out an essay? What do you expect to see? Obviously, every essay starts with an introduction, but an introduction is not just a paragraph of words. It actually has things in it that every introduction has, right? It has the thesis statement. In this essay, I am going to argue that, right? But it also has a first sentence. The thing about marking essays is that if you've been given 30 or 40 essays to write, you start to lose your mind after about 15 or 20 of them. And by 30, 35, you haven't got any idea what day it is. And really, in fairness, you should probably stop now and put it away and come back tomorrow night and do it again. But most people, like first-year students, leave everything to the last minute. There's a deadline. We've got to present. We've got to give these back to the students on Monday, and it's Sunday afternoon. So I'm going to work until 11, 12 o'clock at night and get these things finished. And mistakes are made. Mistakes are made, like, for instance, I used to use a pen when I marked essays, and I wrote all over it things like, this is not what you set out to argue in the first place. You're completely off beam now. And then I go back to check something on page 1, and I realize I'm criticizing an essay I was marking 10 minutes earlier, and I've got the two confused and merged into one. So you really want to be in a position where the examiner is not befuddled about your essay, and you can fix that in your introductory paragraph, right? First of all, you can write a sentence at the beginning that's really interesting. You know, most first-year students say something like, the origins of the Cold War were one of the most momentous occasions in the history of the world, or something glib and dull like that. I'm just checking the chat. Hold on. Rory and Juan, I'll come back to that. Bear with me. Rory, I'll answer you in a second. Starting an essay with something interesting is a way of waking up the examiner and giving them something that's, oh, okay, this is interesting. Yeah, okay, I'm with you. And an example of that would be to say something like, in 1944, don't quote me on the date, the Nazis unearthed a mass grave of 10,000 Polish soldiers in the Katia forest, and began to use this as propaganda to separate the alliance between the Russians and the West. You know, the Polish soldiers had been murdered by the Russian army, and it was propaganda material to sow mistrust. And if your argument was that the mistrust was a component of the origins of the Cold War, that mistrust had dated back to the Second World War, then starting with a sentence like that is just a good way to wake up the examiner and say, you know, I'm interested in this subject, and I can find a way of making you interested in it too. You need to state the theory. I'm going to use realism, I'm going to use idealism or liberalism, depending on who says it today. I'm going to use social constructivism to argue this. Right? And you need to signpost. So signposting is a simple thing that you do throughout an essay where you say, what I'm going to do is this first, and then I'll do that second, and then I'll do that third, and maybe that fourth. And then when you get into your essay, you say, as I promised, I'm going to do this first. In your next paragraph or section, you say, you know, now we're going to move on to what I said I was going to do second. And then and finally, we're going to do what I said I was going to do third. Yeah? And that way, the examiner at 11 o'clock at night, who's absolutely shot and doesn't want to do it anymore, is not struggling to find their way through your essay. Oh, that's right. Yes, Peter did say he was going to do that first, and then he was going to do that second, and he was going to do that third. Good. Peter's doing what he said he was going to do. And he's not only that, he's obviously in complete control of his essay, right? He's not just making it up as he goes along. So signposting needs to be in every paragraph. Going back a step. When you finish your introductory paragraph, you pause and you say, okay, before I start, I'm going to give you some definitions. Right? I need to make sure that the definitions that I'm using throughout my essay are the same definitions that you accept as being true. So for example, we're doing an essay on the origins of the Cold War. What is a Cold War? How do you define a Cold War? Because if you can't define a Cold War, you can't tell me we've entered one. So you always pause and you say, before I start, I just want to get a few things clear. Right? And it's no different to those conferences that you go to or a wedding or whatever, and people say, before we start, I just want to give you some housekeeping. The toilets are over there. If there's a fire alarm, we all assemble over here. And if you need a drink, it's at the back of the room and you have to pay for it. Right? That's the housekeeping thing. Nobody starts any of those conferences or weddings or whatever without addressing those things first. And nobody thinks it's untoward to say something like that. And it's not untoward in an essay to say, before I start the essay, let's just get a few things clear. So what sort of things are you talking about? Well, you're talking about major concepts like what is a Cold War? How does it differ from a hot war? You're talking about theory. When I say I'm going to use realist theory, what does realist theory expect me to discuss? You're talking about other things like, what's another example? What do we mean by the international system? What do we mean by, oh, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, move down, body of the text. So now we're into the thick of it. We're into the serious stuff, the body where you lay out your argument. As I said to you, you're using signposting. First argument's this, second argument's that, third argument's that. Every paragraph is an argument in itself. You don't mix things up. You say, okay, now I'm going to deal with the war period. How was the mistrust handled in the war? Then I'm going to talk about the early days of after the war. And Iraq and Greece and the Bosphorus. And then I'm going to talk about the Berlin blockade in my third paragraph. And I'm going to show you how the Berlin blockade was that threshold that they crossed into being a Cold War. Right? So every paragraph in the body has its own reason for being. The body of the text is the intro, the body, and the summary. And these things are quite distinct to do distinctive jobs. So usually in an essay of about 1,500 words, you've got about 3 things you can say well, and you just tick those 3 things off. You know, when I say that, I mean don't leave things out, but what I mean is that there are probably three main ideas in your essay. I talked about alternative explanations. You're a social scientist, you're expected to show that you know both sides of the story. You just don't present one side of the story and expect it to be right. You know, if your side of the story is right, then other explanations that compete against it, like a liberal explanation or a social constructivist explanation, if you're using realism, then you're going to show that they don't work as well. And that's no different from having a debate. It's no different from having a debate where you say, well, clearly the guys on the other team are idiots. I'm going to address their main points one by one, but they're such idiots that I'm not going to spend any real time on it. Actually, what I don't want to do is get into their arguments in such depth that you start to be swayed by it. What I'm trying to say is I knock it down really quickly. So your alternative explanation section is the second to last thing you do before you do your summary. And it just simply says, now I'm going to look at what a liberal or a constructivist explanation would be and why I don't find it as persuasive. See, signposting is going on there. And then you knock over their ideas very quickly and move on and go to your summary. Okay, so Rory's point was what referencing system to use. And I knew I had something in here that was wrong that I needed to fix before I saw you, and that was it. So Rory, I don't know. I do know that it's in the course outline here. And if you wanted to wait a couple of minutes, I'd find the bit that said it. But there is a house style that the politics department uses. You don't have to use that house style. I think it's Chicago, but it might be APA. I can't remember. I honestly can't remember. I've done a PhD and I still don't know. And the argument is that you can use any one you like, so long as you're consistent and you use it all the way through the essay, right? So if you've got another one you prefer, like Harvard or APA or whatever, go for it, just so long as you're consistent with it. The only comment I would make is that I absolutely detest in-text citing. And that's when you would say the name of the author and the year of the publication. If it doesn't have a page number next to it, I get really angry. And I don't just get angry for my sake, I get angry for quite a large percentage of the political scientists in the world who also get angry with it. If you've come up with something that doesn't make any sense to me, you say Mearsheimer says X, Y, Z, and I think I can't remember ever a time when Mearsheimer said X, Y, Z. Then if you haven't given me the page number, there's absolutely no way I can find it to see whether you have misinterpreted it or whether Mearsheimer did say X, Y, Z, and I've got it wrong. So I get incredibly frustrated when that happens. Equally, if you found some little gem that we've never seen before, perhaps from an article that was written last week by Mearsheimer and is brilliant, then I want to know where that came from and I want to know what page it is on, because I'm going to use it in my next lecture. And if you don't put me the page, give me the page number, my delight with you will turn to anger very quickly. I'm going to stop for a minute and see what new chat things come up. I'm using my old computer, which I tried to get away from. Okay. Rory says, yes, please, thank you for that. Good. Can we just use more than one theory? Renata wants to know, and Maya says, is it sort of like writing a speech way you talk to the reader or not? Yes, good, okay. All right, let's answer those questions very quickly. So one wants to know, is John Lewis Gaddis a liberalist or a realist? There's no such thing as a liberalist. It's a liberal. Almost fell over it myself. Liberalists doesn't exist. If you want to get on Twitter and type liberalist, you'll see a whole lot of political science professors getting mad. Gaddis is a historian who is very rude about political science regularly because he thinks that we're oversimplistic. If he's anything, he's a realist, but he wouldn't subscribe to that. But if you want to read anything into his writing, it's more likely to be realist than it is liberal. Renata, can we use more than one theory? We'll discuss how theories will argue the same thing. Yeah, so that's this thing we were talking about where we said you save that till the end. You save that to your alternative explanation section and you say, I've looked at realism. Realism is my preferred point of view, my preferred explanation, but just to balance things out, I'm now going to look at the other two. You never, ever, ever mix them up. You never say, oh, realism is good for that, but liberalism or social constructivism is good for that. What you do is you debate and you say, I'm going to use realism, I'm going to stick with realism all the way through the essay, and then I'm going to acknowledge the others at the end in my alternative explanations. So Renata, what you would say would be, the one thing that liberalism does better than realism is it explains how regime type, you know, a good democracy versus a non-democracy has some relevance here, you know. I personally, I think that the realism thing is not really weakened by it, but the Liberals have got a point, you know. So nothing wrong with acknowledging that the other guys have done a better job on some things, or just by focusing on something slightly different, illuminate something that my main theory doesn't. But never mix them up and say, I'm going to argue for realism, and then I think about 1946 that liberalism is probably a better theory, and then by 1948 I think social constructivism is pretty good, because you just get yourself into a mess and it's not a coherent argument and you won't get a good mark for it. Maya says this is sort of like writing a speech in the way you talk to the reader. It's exactly like writing a speech, and that's a good thing to have pointed out. Thank you. I believe that the closest analogy, and particularly for those of you that are doing law, is the trial. And that your essay should be written in the way you see courtroom dramas. It is a speech. It's a written speech. And in the courtroom drama, I would get up and I would say, ladies and gentlemen of the court, I am today going to argue that Mr. Patman could never have murdered Ms. Hayward. It is impossible for Mr. Patman to have murdered Ms. Hayward. First of all, Mr. Patman never had the motivation to murder Ms. Hayward. They were good friends. They'd been friends for 30 years. Second, Mr. Patman had nothing to gain by murdering Ms. Hayward. And last, Mr. Patman was not even in the city on the day of Ms. Hayward's death. Therefore, I'm going to argue that he should be absolved of this terrible accusation. Right? That's the way you write a POLS essay. You go in there, you say what you're going to argue, you say why you're going to argue it, that's your thesis statement, and then you go ahead and you argue it. And the fact that Mr. Patman had a gun on him that was still smoking 3 days later is not something that you want to mention because you're defending Mr. Patman. So you don't do anything that will destroy his chances of getting off. Right? Same thing here. Don't poke holes in your argument. Right, there's 4 more and then I'm going to move on. Do you want no in-text citings at all or only in-text citing with a page number? Leah, I don't like in-text citings. I want to see footnotes. You can do it and I won't mark you down for it, but if there's no page numbers there, then I'll be mightily angry. Something I should mention, I'll mention it later. Liberal theorist, yes, liberal theorist is good, Pedro. And Renata, thank you. Good, okay, moving on. Where are we at? Summary. The summary is the bit where you score the most points. Let me tell you what happens when somebody's marking your essay. I start reading it at 11 o'clock at night. You've written a really good introduction. You've done some signposting. You've got a thesis statement that looks really intelligent. Your intro's fantastic, really good. And I'm thinking, I think I'm going to give Leah an A for this. This looks like an A essay. I only read the first paragraph, but she looks like she's in control of this essay. This is going to be an A essay. And then I spend the rest of the essay trying to determine whether I'm right. Has Leah done enough to get an A? Maybe she's done enough to get an A+. Or maybe halfway through it, she kind of drops the ball and goes off on a tangent and starts to waver a bit. And I'm thinking, it's not really an A, but maybe it's an A-. Oh, look at this. Oh, this is awful. It's a B+. So what you're trying to do throughout the essay is convince me that my initial reaction that you deserved an A is well-founded. It's less likely, and not impossible, but less likely that I'm going to start off saying, oh, it's a B, and then give you an A+ at the end. In fact, I don't think that would ever happen. But I could start with an A and whittle it down to a B very easily. So by the time you get to your summary, that's the part where you're scoring points. That's the bit where you're reminding me that I thought it was an A or maybe an A+ at the very beginning, and you've done enough to deserve that. What most people do is they write summaries that are just all over in a tick. And it's like, thank God I can finish this thing. And they're out, they've gone. And you say, well, that wasn't really a summary, that was just an end, an abrupt end to it. So summary is, again, like the courtroom drama, where you say, I came here today to show that Mr. Patman was innocent and could not have murdered Ms. Hayward. First of all, I showed you that Mr. Patman did not have the motivation to murder Ms. Hayward. Second, I showed you that he stood to gain nothing from murdering Ms. Hayward. And last, I showed you that he wasn't even in town on the day. Therefore, I have conclusively proved to you that he is innocent. That is the way you finish an essay. Let's go back and see what the latest chat is. Do we have to do footnoting, or can we just have a reference section? It's a 1,500-word essay. How are you going to cite a quotation if you don't have footnoting or in text? You've got to tell me I got that quote from somewhere, or I got that piece of information from somewhere, and it's either going to be in text or it's going to be a footnote. I see your point. It's a valid one. It's only a 1,500-word essay. Why don't you just wait till you get to the bloody end and read the bibliography? But that's not the way we write essays. So the answer to that is give me footnoting. And if you're really antagonizing me, give me in text. Last of all, when you finish the essay, go back and rewrite the introduction. 9 times out of 10, your introduction looks nothing like your summary, and they have to mirror each other. So the last thing you do is you write your introduction. And that lets you off quite a lot of things. But if you've got your essay question at the top and you've got something that's more or less says what you're going to argue in the introduction, you wait till the end, you say, well, did I argue what I said I was going to argue in the introduction? Not quite. Go and tidy it up and fix it. The fact is, the introduction is probably the place where the examiner is going to decide what your mark is, and the summary is the place where your examiner decides whether he's right in his first impressions or not. So the two have to work with each other really hard. Stop asking me these bloody chat questions. I'll come back to it. Alternative explanations. So I think I've done all of this. It is a scientific method, so you'd expect to be able to falsify your argument. You would say, what would people say that said my argument wasn't any good? Well, they're wrong. Other explanations might be just as good. Your argument just has to be persuasive. I talked about that. Showing that you have an understanding of what the other arguments would be shows you are quite a sophisticated thinker, and you're not going to get an A+ if you don't do it. You might be lucky and get an A if you don't do it, but if you write in a sophisticated way and show you're a sophisticated thinker, that's the key to getting a top mark. And it's a debate, so kill the alternative explanations quickly. Don't spend a lot of time on them. They should be all over in 2 sentences. Sentence 1 says, this is what the Liberals would say. Sentence 2 says, this is why it's no good. Sentence 3 says, this is what the constructivists would say. Sentence 4 says, that's why it's no good. More or less that fast. There's the bibliography included in the word count, asks Rachel. No, it's not, and neither are the footnotes. And that is a genius question, Rachel, because if the footnotes aren't counted in the word count, can you put things in the footnotes that might get you extra marks? And the simple answer to that is yes. So when I was an undergrad, again, not so long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I used to pad my essays out with a whole lot of other stuff that was in my footnotes because it wasn't in the word count, and it would show that I'd done lots of reading. And there's nothing more annoying, particularly at master's and PhD level, of having something that you spent days reading and you can't show off that you've read it. So footnotes is a great way to do that. Don't go overboard, don't go crazy and have more stuff in your foot. I did go crazy, I'll admit to this. And have more stuff in your footnotes than you've got on the rest of your page. But by all means, use the footnotes as a way of sneaking in extra things. Usually the way it's done is you're saying something like, what's the example? Marx believed that there was going to be a world revolution and that all he needed to do was give it a little bit of a nudge at the Berlin blockade and the rest of Europe would go communist. And then in your footnotes, you might say, for example, in the Bolshoi opera speech, Marx said this, and that's clearly showing what his thinking was. So you've scored an extra point, a brownie point at the very least, by showing that you can add something to it without getting into a whole lot of detail in the main text. Okay. Presentation. Looking professional is really important. Now, I know that Apple and probably Microsoft Word have templates which just look gorgeous in some cases, particularly Apple. Within reason, use those. Remember, you're supposed to have it in 12-point, and it's supposed to be in times. So don't pick something that's over decorative. But if you can find a template that just makes your essay look like $1 million, do it. Because the other end of it, the other possibility is that you have something that looks like the dog's breakfast. And you're saying, well, that doesn't matter because the content is fantastic. I'm clearly a genius. The fact that it looks like shit is neither here nor there. But nobody ever got an A+ for handing in a dog's breakfast. Well, when I say nobody, not really anybody. So presentation is actually probably worth 3 to 5% for you if it looks pretty, it looks professional. And that also includes spell check and it also includes grammar. Then that's what might move you from an A to an A+. Just that this person's got everything right. They have to have an A+. It's got to be easy to mark. You're supposed to stick a margin in there, so there's plenty of space for the examiner to write comments in. It's hard when you haven't got any margins to write anything, and then their stuff looks sloppy. It's supposed to be 12-point and times. I got to using basketball because 12-point basketball actually looked a lot tidier, and it looked like 11-point times. And for me, 12-point looks like it's a primary school reader. And I don't want my beautiful essays to look like they're written by a 5-year-old or supposed to be read by 5-year-olds. Referencing, grammar, and spelling. Every year in POLS104, there's at least one tutor, and I don't know who it is this year, who gives marks off for bad spelling, for bad grammar, and for bad referencing, and up to 5% sometimes. So it's not worth you handing in something that hasn't been proofread properly. Why would you want to lose that? I mean, I don't know who the tutor is. I don't personally give much of a toss. If it's got lots of spelling mistakes in it, then I will point it out, and I won't take the writer that seriously because I think this person doesn't care about their own essays. But if you've got 2 or 3 spelling mistakes in it, you know, God knows, I end up with spelling mistakes on the front page of my PhD. I'm not any more perfect than you are. But the benefit is to have something that's proofread by a friend, somebody that's never seen it before. It doesn't matter if it's your mum and she says, I don't know anything about international relations. You're not asking her to read it for sense of content. You're asking her to tell you whether you've put any spelling mistakes or bad grammar in it. It's worth it, and very often they'll pick up something that you've seen a million times and never picked up. And the additional benefit of that is that if you print it out rather than read it on your screen, you will always find mistakes that you'll never see on your screen. So printing it out is absolutely de rigueur, has to be done. Every time I've ignored that rule and just sent something that I proofread on the screen, there's always been a spelling mistake in it. It's designed to bite you on the bum. Grading. Some papers have grading metrics. Ask your tutor if you're doing something other than POLS104. Don't bore your lecturer. Try to make what you're writing interesting. Wake them up. Remember that your lecturer has an answer in mind. He'll be saying those things often in lectures. He'll say, and a key point to remember here is and then you write that down and say, I'll go back to that and make sure that key point is stressed in the essay. And if you're not happy with your mark, ask for a recount. Law students have no compunction to come up to me and say, why on earth didn't I get 100% for this essay? They're very cheeky. But if you're disappointed and you think it was worth more, definitely come to me or come to Robert or go to your tutor. If you're embarrassed to go to your tutor, come to me. Sometimes, as I say, it's been marked at midnight and they're just tired and they didn't read it properly, and it's as simple as that. Sometimes they've got to be in their bonnet about something you've done, which I don't agree with or Robert doesn't agree with. So don't besiege us with horrible remarkings, but if you think that you deserve more, give us a call. All right, I realize I've been doing this now for an hour, beracing you for an hour, so I'm going to try and buzz through this reasonably quickly. So we've got 4 essay questions. I believe this is due on the 11th or the 12th of April, so we've got just over 2 weeks to do it. Some of you will have already started. Some of you will have already started and be annoyed with me for saying that there is another way of doing it than the one you've done. If you've done that, send me your draft essay to where it is now, and I'll have a read of it. Otherwise, you can start with a fairly clean slate. We've got 4 questions. I'm going to tell you which ones I favour and why, and then I'm going to try and show you how you might answer them. So the first question is, what is distinctive about the study of international relations? How does the study differ from other academic disciplines? Second one is, to what extent was the bipolar international order a major departure from past international systems? And these last 2, which I favour as being the best essays to write. Would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm for interpreting international relations? What are the strengths and weaknesses of realism as a theory of international relations? And is it true that the Cold War began after the Berlin blockade crisis of 1948? So the last 2 are the ones I think are the best bang for your bucks. I'll explain why in a minute. All of these essays are linked to lectures. Lecture 1, what is IR? Defining it, what's distinctive about it, major actors, levels of analysis. Was lecture 1 or lecture 2? Lecture 1 if you don't count the introduction. That answers the first question reasonably well. International systems, I think, was lecture 2. And Robert talked about a definition of the international system. He talked about classical, transitional, bipolar, and unipolar. So yes, you could do your bipolarity question from that, at least as a starting point. Lecture 3, I think, was where he told you about realism, idealism, and social constructivism. And 4 and 5 were origins of Cold War and the Berlin crisis. So some of those overlap, those lectures overlap for answering questions, but the basis of the essays are already there, and you go back to your notes, and that's your starting point. Okay, let's look at the first question. What is distinctive about the study of international relations? And try to apply to it some of the questions that I suggested that you would do a few minutes ago. So the most important thing is to get the essay question right. And the question is, what is the question asking us or asking us to do? First of all, it's saying what is distinctive about the study of international relations. So there would be an expectation that you would give us a definition of international relations before you progressed with your argument. So in that first paragraph after the introduction, I would expect you to tell me what you think we mean by international relations and the implications of a definition. If it's international relations is about the relationship of states with each other, then what about NGOs and multinational corporations? because Roberts includes those two other elements in his definition. Can anybody tell me why he includes those two elements in his definition? Tarifa, how about you give it a stab?
Do you mind repeating the question again?
What was that, sorry?
Do you mind repeating the question again?
Yes. Robert's definition of international relations says it's something to do with the relationship of states between each other, but he also includes multinational corporations and NGOs, non-government organizations. Why does he include those two?
I think it's because mainly realist point of view, right? They actually emphasize that the state is the main actor, but then in recent times, there is a lot of evidence that like other organizations and like multinational corporations play a huge role in the international arena as well.
Yeah, that's a pretty good answer. So what Tarifa is saying is that if you're a realist, you're really only interested in states interacting with other states, and you consider them to be the major players in the international system and everybody else to be, you know, an add-on. But if you're a liberal, which Robert is, then you allow for the fact that there are other things other than states which have some power in the international system, and that a company the size of Apple or Microsoft or whatever is important too. And an organization like the United Nations or the Red Cross or Amnesty International or whatever might also have a bit of power to persuade states to do things. That having military strength is not the all and end all, that there's something we call soft power, which is the ability to influence other states in a more benign way. And he's a liberal, so he says that. So when I say, what are the implications of this definition? You can see that that when he talks about international relations being a contested field, that there are reasons why it's contested, and it depends on things like theories. What's the objective of the study of international relations? What's the background history of this? So, you know, if you look at E.H. Carr, which I know Robert mentions very briefly in lecture 2, I think, E.H. Carr was a British historian that was writing about the Treaty of Versailles, and arguing how is it that World War I, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, the Great War, 20 years later, you've got World War II looming. You know, how is this whole idea that the liberal peace movement that was going to make the world a safer place? Woodrow Wilson had said that America was making the world safe for democracy. How come by 1939, we're facing down another war again, possibly more ugly and more violent than the one that preceded it? International relations as a discipline comes out of a question like that, which is, what have we got wrong? Why do we keep having wars? And so when you say what's distinctive about the study of international relations, part of that answer is that we're looking for patterns. We're looking to explain big things that keep reoccurring, like wars. And that's very different from history, particularly, where we might have a focus on why that particular war happened, but not necessarily a focus on similarities between other wars. So you can see that when we write an essay, we can ask a lot of questions about the essay question. And that helps us put together an argument. It helps us put together quite a sophisticated argument. This question here about the extent of the bipolar international order, I never recommend anybody does this. One of the reasons why I'll explain in a minute, but the main reason why is because it's a really difficult question. And if you write a really good answer, you're going to be stepping outside what Robert had told you to look at. If you want to get an A+, I believe you have to ask questions about what kind of polarity is the safest. And that's Kenneth Waltz, for the most part, who said that bipolarity was safer than multipolarity because there's only two players in the bipolar system, and it's a lot easier to read the minds of your adversary when there's only two of you and you're not having to think about a third or a fourth or a fifth. It also means that if you're concentrating your military forces against one player, you don't have to worry about defections from the third or fourth or fifth guys who might go over to the other side in seconds. So Waltz argued that if you're thinking about polarity, the reason why the Cold War stayed cold was because of nuclear weapons and because bipolarity was a much simpler system than multipolarity. Now, you can write that essay, and I can give you the stuff to write, but I don't think that without it, you're going to write an A or an A+ essay. There won't be any depth to your essay if you just stick to the notes that you learned in the lecture. That's my personal view. If you're in my class, don't do it, unless you want to go down the Waltzian thing and ask me about those notes. Okay, here's the two I favor, and now I'm going to tell you why I favor them. The first question is, would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm? And what are the weaknesses of realism as a theory of international relations? And this is the one where it really does demonstrate how you have to interrogate the question before you start writing it. Because he's asking two questions in that first sentence. He's saying, would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm for interpreting international relations? Is it a convincing paradigm for interpreting international relations? And you remember that Robert is not a realist, he's a liberal. So he's asking you a question that he already knows the answer to, which is that he doesn't consider it is a convincing paradigm. He thinks that liberalism is a more convincing paradigm for interpreting international relations. I'll give you an example of that. When we had the pandemic start in 2020, or was it 21? I don't know. I got in the lift with Robert, and we were talking about the news that day, and I said to him, look, I was teasing. I said, look, this is a perfect illustration of why realism is right, because what's the first thing that states do when they are faced with a pandemic? They lock down all their borders. They pursue their self-interest. They say, this is an anarchic world out there. There's nobody to help me but myself. I'm going to help myself first. Think about my own interests. Think about my own self-preservation. I said, this is a great illustration of realism at work. And Robert blew a stack, got really hot under the collar with me and said, this is an illustration of why realism is wrong. Because he said, in an event like that, the last thing you should be doing is closing down your borders and worrying about it itself. This is a problem at an international scale that can only be solved through cooperation between states. And he's right. But that's not the point. The point is that realism says that states facing their own security will look after themselves first, and that's what they were doing. It doesn't prove that realism is wrong because they were doing it. It proves that realism is right because they were doing it. What it also proves, on a different argument, is that states pursuing their own security first is probably not the right remedy. It's not the right remedy for climate change either. But the theory is working. It's demonstrating what it set out to show. So the point I'm making in a long-winded way is that when Robert asks a question about realism being a convincing paradigm, he doesn't believe it is a convincing paradigm. So you've got two choices. You can either argue that it is a convincing paradigm because you find it convincing and do it in a way that's good. If I'm your tutor, because I'm a realist, I will look upon that with favor. But Robert is not a mean and vindictive person, even though he got angry with me in the lift. We're good mates. What he's saying is, if you've got a good argument, I will respect that that's a good argument, even though I don't agree with it myself. Right? And the second thing that's coming out of that first sentence, and the bit that everybody misses, in my view, is that word remains. And most people skip past that. Would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm? And that's a very different question from would you agree that realism is the most convincing paradigm? And so you've got to update your realism in this essay if you're going to tackle this question. And you've got to say, if you're asking me this question about remains, then you're telling me that sometime somebody questioned whether it was relevant anymore. And if there was ever a time when realism was questioned for its relevance, it was the post-Cold War, when we had a relative peace in the world and there were no great power wars. There was no real contest between the big states. They were mostly working together pretty happily. And at that point, realism fell out of favor. I mean, there were already people that didn't like the realists because they considered them to be obsessed with war and military might. But it really fell out of favor because there was no evidence in the world that great power politics was happening. And that all of a sudden took a swing in about 2008 and 2014, after almost 30 years of realism being relegated to the closets of the universities, the political science rooms. You know, we're not using that anymore, it doesn't work. Because in 2008, you have the rise of China, you have the great financial crisis, the world financial crisis. China steps in and says, it's okay, America, we can help you. We'll pump money into the American economy and save the world from financial ruin. And China comes out of that feeling pretty good about itself for good reasons and says, hey, you know, we're here. We are a superpower. We just saved the world. In 2014, Russia invades Crimea and just takes it. Says, oh, this is ours now. Sorry, mates. So this whole idea of great power contestation starts to kick in again. And all of a sudden, the realists are coming out of their closets and they're saying, have I got a theory for you that explains what's going on? The world is anarchic. There is states that are worried about their security and they start to behave in ways that are going to maximize their security. And all that stuff about world trade and that can go out the door in seconds if a state is freaking out about its security, like Russia is with Ukraine today. So all of a sudden the realists came back. And so that question about whether or not it remains the most convincing paradigm is extremely relevant if you say, well, okay, I accept that there was a time when realism was not very favored. And there was a time when realism wasn't really explaining the little wars that were going on between Islam and Christians, or the civil wars between tribes. You know, maybe constructivism for a long time there was the better explanation for that kind of behavior. But now we've got great power competition again, and we've got it in spades. So that's what I mean by exploring the question. Yep, okay. So I'm not going to go into any depth now about how the different theories work against each other. The Melian dialogue ought to have given you a basis for it. As I say, if you want the right texts to cite, that will give you very quickly in a snapshot what each of these theories says. Then come and talk to me about it. I don't have any problem handing them out. I don't think you should spend your whole life looking for the damn things. Okay, I'll just briefly do this. So those of you in my class will be more familiar with this now. There are different realisms. There's not one realism. It's a family of realisms. The predominant one today is called neorealism, and it goes something like this. States are the primary actors in the world. They're unitary in the sense they act like a person. They make one decision and they act to that decision. If I go to war, as New Zealand goes to war, it goes to war as one person. You don't have the Ministry of Defence saying we're going to war and the Ministry of Education saying we're not going to war, and some interest group in Auckland, the citizens ratepayers of Auckland, saying no, we're switching sides. The state makes a decision as one actor, as a unitary actor, and that's how we assume they behave against each other. And we don't do things without making a rational cost-benefit analysis. Things like wars, things like trade are important things. It's the equivalent of you buying a house or a car. You don't make a decision about going to war without thinking through all of the ramifications of that, whether you're capable of going to war, how long you'll last, who will your allies be, what might beat you, do they have a secret weapon that you hadn't thought about, you know, all those things. You make a rational decision-making process before you go to war. And realism says that these things are what characterize a state. What characterizes the international system is that there is no world government, which we call anarchy. No sense of order, no sense of a hierarchy, except that the biggest guys are the baddest, and no international laws or international police force to enforce those laws that stop states doing what they want. And because of this, uncertainty that this system creates, states fear for their security. They particularly fear for their security if they're right next door to a greedy or aggressive state like Ukraine and Russia. Then they're always thinking about their security. If they're a small state like North Korea that's been at war with the West since the 1950s, they're very mindful of their security, and they go and seek out nuclear weapons in order to make themselves feel more secure. This is because there isn't anybody else above ordinary states, a world government, that could come and say to people, as states that are behaving badly, get back in your box, matey, or I'll do something about it. So greedy states like Russia can be greedy and get away with it. States become very worried about the power of their power relative to the other states. And if another state's growing and they're not growing, or they're not growing as fast as that state, then you have what we call a shift in the balance of power towards the state that's growing faster. And that scares states willy-nilly, because a faster growing state can afford a bigger army. It can afford a whole lot of things that a smaller state can't do. That's why you see this contestation between the US and China, because China is growing so fast compared to the US that the US sees its power diminishing, slipping away. And the US gets very worried about that. Balance of power changes. That creates uncertainty in the world, and it's what leads to wars. Security becomes the #1 goal of all states, because if you're not a state anymore, somebody's taken you over, and you're an ex-state, then you can't pursue any of the other goals that you wanted. You know, maybe you really wanted a booming economy, or maybe you wanted to build parks and theme parks and cinemas everywhere. Well, you can't do that if you're no longer a state. So the first goal of every state is its own security. And as I say, some states, that's a paramount goal. States therefore have to look after themselves because they can't be sure that other states will, when it comes down to the final reckoning, the other states will help them. So states always have a permanent army as a very bare minimum of insurance policy. And states start to think about relative gains, which is if I lose something, then you win it. If you win something, if I win something, then you lose it. You can see how that works very easily in territory, where if it's not mine, it's yours. If it's not yours, it's mine. We don't share territory. But we also think of that in terms of other resources like oil or steel, and iron, and food even, or water. You've got examples in Iraq, where Turkey's been using all of the water from the Tigris and the Euphrates at its source for their own irrigation. By the time the river flows down to Iraq, the riverbeds are all drying up. So water scarcity and food scarcity, any kind of scarcity, means that you're losing and somebody else is gaining, and that heightens your insecurity. There's two types of realism. One of them is the neorealism I just described, where the organizing principle of neorealism is this idea that there's no world government and all of the fear and uncertainty that that creates. And then there's classical realism or human nature realism, which says that we are by nature an aggressive animal that has a gene that's aggressive or competitive in us. And that's the reason why we have wars. You can see that quite different explanations, and that shows how realism actually has a number of different points of view. It's not a simple one that says it's about struggle for power. There's much more to realism than just that. Liberalism agrees that states are important, as we were just discussing, but also individuals, non-governmental organizations, and multinational corporations are also part of the system. They also agree that we have anarchy in the world, and that does create uncertainty. But the nice thing about uncertainty is that you can make things more certain by just introducing some elements that bring certainty or more certainty into that. You don't have to always be fearful. And they say that we can have lasting peace in the world when states cooperate. There's such a thing as the harmony of interests. So we're talking about this realist view that states are worried about things, and they start thinking about win-lose situations. If you win it, I lose it. If I win it, you lose it. The Liberals don't agree with that, and they say that there are things like the desire to overcome the pandemic or the desire to overcome climate change, which is in everybody's interests, and it's a public good, a world public good. If we get rid of climate change and we find a way of solving that. So states don't need to think about themselves and their security. They can actually look past that in the Liberal view and look more towards that harmony of interest. The Liberals believe that democracy is the right government, probably the only government for peace. That democracies just don't go to war with each other. We would never dream of going to war against Australia because they're another democracy. We wouldn't dream of going to war with the UK or France or any of those people because they're another democracy. They think like us, they act like us. If we get into a fight with another democracy, we got into a fight with Australia a few years back when they banned our apples for an awful long time because they said our apples were diseased and they didn't want them in the country. What did? We took them to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, we took them to court, and we resolved that in court. Because that's what you do in democracies. If you've got a fight with somebody, you take them to court. You don't pull out your gun and shoot them. In a non-democracy, it's much more free for all. If you have a fight with somebody and you pull out your gun and shoot you, so long as you've got a buddy that backs you up on that one, you're fine. It doesn't happen in democracies. So the idea that we have an anarchic world where there's no real world government pulling it together, this could be overcome by having rules. And if everybody agrees to rules, then those people who are tempted to cheat will not be tempted to cheat. We have sanctions that we put on states that cheat. We leave them out of organizations that they would benefit from. And that's the reason why we can look past anarchy and say, well, actually, there's a way where we can create some certainty of democracy, certainty of rules that we agree to, and lastly, the certainty of trade. If everybody's trading together, everybody's getting something out of it. Why on earth would you have a war? Why would you undo all of that good work? So the Liberals are thinking about what they call absolute gains, which is a win-win situation. Everybody gets something out of peace. Everybody gets something out of cooperation. And that's why they think that the realists are so bleak, because they say, look, the world doesn't have to be like this. The world could be a whole lot better if everybody would cooperate. And the realists say, but the world's not like that. And that's where you've got the very beginnings of a big argument. Is the world one where we have wars because we keep making the same mistakes over and over again? Or do we get better inch by inch and become more progressive and a friendlier, more cooperative, more peaceful world? That's the nub of the liberal versus realist debate. Constructivism is the last one, and then we'll more or less wrap it up. I know I've gone on way longer than I intended. The thing about constructivism is they say the realists and the liberals are just looking at the one part of the picture, and there's a lot more to the way the world works than the realists and the liberals seem to take into consideration. There are things that people will go to war for that have got nothing to do with resources, like whether I've got enough food, or whether I want to get my hands on oil or gold. And one of those things that they'll go to war over is ideas. A religion is at its heart an idea, and people will fight for that idea. Communism and democracy and free trade are ideas, and people will fight over those ideas. That's what we see happening at the moment in Ukraine. We also see in Ukraine a fight for independence, nationhood, and sovereignty. And, Ukraine is an independent sovereign state. There is a nation of Ukrainians who consider themselves to be distinct from Russians. They have a distinct language. They have a distinct history. They have a distinct culture, music, arts, all of those things, and they will fight for it. You bet they'll fight for it. And part of the argument is that the Russians don't acknowledge that they have a separate identity. And they say, you're Russians and you should be part of the Russian system. You don't have a right to be a sovereign, independent state. So the constructivists are adding another layer, and that layer is a layer of ideas, culture, history, values, and identity. And those things are abstract ideas. They're abstract things that you can't point at and say, that's that over there. There is nationhood. There is Ukrainian nationhood. You can point at the clothes that they're wearing or the music that they're listening to and say, well, there's evidence that they may have, but you can't actually say that that's something tangible that they will fight for. And the realists particularly don't like it because it just muddies the waters for realists. But the constructivists say, well, those things are real, and they're things that shape the way that states behave. Right? So most constructivists, or at least some constructivists, accept that the world is anarchic, that there's no world government. Yes, okay, that's fine. But they say, slavery is an example of something that was normal once. And nobody really got too upset about it. Maybe the slaves did, but everybody just accepted that was the way life was. And then that idea dramatically changed into something else, into a norm against slavery in the 18th century. And so they argue that these abstract ideas can change and morph and become something else. And anarchy is no different in an idea. It can be shaped into something else. Similarly, they say identities can change. I can start off thinking I'm a good guy and thinking everybody thinks I'm a good guy. But in my behavior, I may not be doing good things. I may be an utter ratbag. And somebody says to me, Peter, you're a ratbag. And I might, not necessarily, ratbags don't always have that level of circumspection, but I might start to change my view of myself as a result of what other people think of me. Maybe I get angry and I become worse. Or maybe I decide to change my ways and become a nice guy like I wanted to be. The point is that identity can be shaped by other actors. And that's what we call intersubjectivity. We're subjective about our relationships with other states. And they have this thing called discourses, which the constructivists use quite a lot, which is just simply the idea that an idea becomes, it takes hold. It becomes a dominant idea, or it becomes a powerful idea and shapes people's lives. And the best example of that is the idea that women are the weaker sex, which is an idea that's changed and nobody believes that anymore. But you go back 50 or 60 years or a little bit longer, and a lot of people, including women, believed that myth, that discourse, that story, that narrative, because it was something that was entrenched. We'd gone back a long way. So again, constructivists are very hopeful that those sorts of ideas can change, but they say those sorts of ideas actually have an enormous amount of power. And the last thing, and this is something that the realists and liberals do acknowledge rather grumpily now, is that, that if there was a level of analysis argument, that identity certainly adds another layer to the realist and liberal discussion. And what you're seeing is particularly realists like Mearsheimer are starting to think about things like nationalism, which is a very abstract term, and the power of nationalism in terms of world violence. So the constructivists have brought an awful lot to the table, and it's a terrific theory. It's just a lot harder to use because you're not using things like statistics or concrete things like they've got a bigger army than they've got, or their GDP is growing at an enormous rate, and you can prove that. It's a lot harder to prove a constructivist argument. It requires probably a lot more research and looking in different places. All right, the last one I want to look at is a question that I've invented, but it's not too different from the origins of the Cold War question. My question is, the USSR created buffer states after World War II. What argument would the realists take on that? So this is where the tick the box thing that I was talking about earlier kicks in, right? Because the realist theory would expect you to look for certain things, and if you found them, then the theory is working, right? And this is a good example of it. So firstly, the realists would say, was there anarchy after the Second World War? And the answer to that is yes, there was no world government. The United Nations was set up 45, 46, but it wasn't even close to being a world government. But certainly it didn't make up world laws, and certainly it didn't have a world police force. It relied on the police forces of particularly the United States and other nations to agree to do things. So if the United States stepped out of line, the United Nations certainly wasn't going to put it back in line again. And the same is true, of course, all of the other large states. So no, there was no world government. Yes, there was anarchy. So the next thing that leads from that was there uncertainty after the Second World War? Were states worried about their security? And yes, there was a great deal of uncertainty about what would happen next. And you see that from your stories. And you see that the USSR, after the end of the Second World War, is very worried about its security, particularly the USSR, because they've just been through a really nasty war where 20 million of their soldiers have been killed and population, whole cities like now in Ukraine were absolutely devastated. The economy is in ruins and they're doing their best to make themselves secure and stop this from happening again. So you see them pulling material and factories apart in Germany and shipping those home to Russia where they can reassemble them and start their economy again. And you see a real concern with this flat plain that runs across from Germany through Poland into Russia, which is so easy for militaries to go through really quickly. Napoleon had rolled his artillery across there in a matter of weeks. Hitler had done it more or less in a matter of days. And the Russians are saying this flat plain is dangerous to us. It's historically, it's geographically dangerous to us. We have to find a way of slowing those armies down so they don't attack us again. All of these things are things that realist theory expects to see happen, and you're ticking the boxes using your evidence and saying it is happening and the theory is working. Right? Is there a balance of power problem? Yes, there is. The US came out of the Second World War with 50% of the world's GDP. It was a very strong nation out of the Second World War. And the one thing the Soviets want to do is catch up and contest the size and power of the United States. Right? It's a real balance of power issue. And lastly, are we seeing examples of relative gains? This zero-sum thinking. If you win it, I lose it. If I lose it, you win it. And the Berlin blockade is just such a good example of that. But it's all going on all around Europe, where the Soviets are saying, we're not leaving. We're happy where we are. Thank you very much. We're not giving it to you. So when you're thinking about writing an essay as ticking boxes, this is much more preferable to the system, the other system of just taking a whole lot of notes and stringing them together and hoping the whole thing holds together in argument. The theory is like telling you where to look, what to find, and if you find it, the theory says, good, you're building an argument based on the way the theory works. And you can say, I'm arguing from a realist perspective or a liberal perspective or a social constructivist perspective, and I know what I have to look out for using this theory, and I know when the theory is working, and therefore I know that my essay is working. All right, so that's it. I'm sorry I went on for almost 2 hours. I hope it was of value. The recording I will convert and put onto our Facebook pages. And I invite you, if you've got a draft essay that you want me to have a look at, to send it to me, or anything that's worrying you, or you want some clarification on. So email me at peter.grace.otago@nz. And we will talk about it. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Peter, I just had a quick question. Whether you had a slide, I don't know if I just missed it, but when you kind of went through each of the essay questions and you kind of broke them down into answering the question. I was just wondering whether you had a slide of that for that last question of, is it true that the Cold War began after the Berlin blockade?
Yeah, so I sort of went through that with this question about the buffer states, right?
Okay.
So the question you would be asking about the Cold War, is it true that it began at the Berlin blockade, right? I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, what is a Cold War? And if you think the Cold War is a battle of ideologies, you know, communism versus capitalism or communist versus democracy, then you're going to be in a liberal or you're going to be in a constructivist argument because they are interested in those things. If you're arguing that a Cold War is just a point where armies start to confront each other, but they never fire a shot, but there's definitely some sort of military muscle knocking heads together, it just never spills over into a hot war, then you're going to be in the realist argument, right? The realists will be saying, well, it's about power and resources and security. And it's not in their interests to let this spill into being a hot war. Right? And then if you're going to ask about the Cold War itself, you have to give some explanation about how the Cold War came about. So if you say, well, the Cold War started in the Bolshevik Revolution and the fear that the West had of communism, then you're probably in a constructivist argument because you're talking about ideas. If you say that the Cold War started because it was a fight between democracy and non-democracy or a totalitarian regime, then you'll be in a liberal argument because you're interested in democracy as being the good factor. If you're saying, actually, it's a security issue, and I'm not surprised that the USSR behaved the way they did because they were shitting themselves at the end of the Second World War. They were still worried about being invaded. They were still worried about the fact that the Americans wanted to destroy Soviet Russia. And had always done so, because if you look at the Civil War, the Americans and the British were in that White Russian War, fighting it out in the 1920s. Then you're in a realist argument where you start to think about the things that the Russians were doing, like expanding into Europe to create this buffer region that would slow armies down. You're in this area where the USSR are thinking about relative gains. Don't let those guys get away with anything more. You're in the area of containment theory, where the Americans say, we're not going to try and roll back what the Russians have achieved, but we're not going to let them achieve anything more. We're going to stop them with counterforce. So you can see how the different theories are going to give you different arguments and give you completely different essays.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. That was a really
Makes
good.
sense?
Yeah, no, that was exactly. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks for your help.
Rebecca, you're still there. Did you want to have a chat? Rebecca? No? Okay, well.
Sorry, thank you.
Oh, there you are. Okay. All right. We'll see you later.